So in this episode, we're going to talk about how we cope with inconsistent thoughts. We're going to talk about cognitive dissonance and how to use the psychological phenomenon in our favor in order to change behaviors. So a while ago, with the death of George Floyd, there was a lot of focus on racism on the media and how racism still prevails in today's society. And just a little disclaimer before we start. Even though the main focus of this episode is really not racism per se, I will be discussing it merely to illustrate my point. But yeah, this is really not supposed to be a lecture on racism, so I just want you to bear that in mind. Something that I've seen a lot of people do when trying to approach the topic of racism and white privilege on the media, and something that I do not exactly agree with, is that people automatically rule out the possibility that they themselves are racists, and I think this is wrong. So when it comes to topics such as racism, everyone seems to want to change others before changing themselves first. They want to skip that step and move on to educating other people when they themselves are not sufficiently educated in the first place. And I might be making the same mistake now by talking about this topic, but as I warned you in the beginning, I'm not trying to lecture anyone about racism. The key message here is based on understanding how we deal with uncomfortable situations and how we can use the discomfort they cause to change the way we behave. So when we are confronted with sensitive topics, it's normal to distance ourselves from the person that we consider as racist, because basically there are a whole load of negative labels that we associate to racism, which are activated at the same time that we bring this person to mind. A stereotypical racist person is usually understood as someone who is mean, uneducated, selfish, and just indifferent to others. And as we do not seem to have anything in common with these features, we think that this means we are not racists, because we have nothing in common with what we believe are the key features of this stereotype. But the truth is that not all racists correspond to the stereotype. And that is why I think it's wrong to automatically assume that there is no way we can be associated with racism, just because if you think about it, it's not very common to find a person who is admittedly racist. Usually racist people don't see themselves as racists. It's like with addictions. So an addict doesn't usually think of themselves as having an addiction problem. Now, why is that? Why are we this way? Why do we experience psychological discomfort when we are confronted with an addiction problem? And racism can be considered an addiction from this perspective. Well, when this happens, we are very likely to experience cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance suggests that human beings are aversive to inconsistencies in their thinking, and these inconsistencies make us uncomfortable. We enter in a state of psychological conflict every time our behavior is not in line with our beliefs. For instance, if we think about a person who smokes, but who also thinks that smoking causes cancer, we can see that they are acting opposite to what they think, because it just doesn't make sense that someone who knows that smoking is bad then goes on to keeping on smoking. So they experience cognitive dissonance because there is a discrepancy in terms of how they act and how they believe they should be acting. Now, even if we are not addicts, and even if racism does not affect us on a personal level, it still troubles us to think that racism exists, because a lot of people hold the belief in a just world, a world where good people are compensated for their good behavior and bad people are punished for their evil intentions, and racism is simply just not compatible with this belief. So when I think about cognitive dissonance, Milgram's classical study immediately comes to mind. It is a study about obedience and about the way people resolve their conflicts when faced in a situation where obeying an authority figure means going against one's own personal beliefs of what is right and wrong. This study happened in 1963, and it aimed to improve our understanding of what happened during World War II. The people who killed in behalf of Hitler justify their actions by saying that they were simply following orders. So Hitler was an extreme of racism, and we usually see him as an exception to the rule, or at least I hope we do. But if we think about it, Hitler himself did not kill a lot of people directly with his own hands, right? He killed a lot of people because a lot of soldiers killed on his behalf, but can we say that these people who killed on behalf of Hitler were racists? Was the whole of Germany racist? I think there is a big difference between committing a hate crime and being a racist. In the same way that there is a distinction between prejudice and discrimination. So whilst prejudice refers to an ideology, discrimination refers to an action. So it could be that you are racist and therefore prejudiced, but never having discriminated against anyone. And on the other hand, it could also be that you might have discriminated against someone without this meaning that you had a racist intention behind it. And I believe this to be the case of most soldiers who were under Hitler's command, or at least my belief in a just world wants me to believe this is the case. And in this case, obedience is what leads to discrimination, not racism per se. So it's hard for me to believe that all Germans were racists. I believe that many Germans were in a state of cognitive dissonance and that they felt forced to do something with which they did not agree with. And the way that they resolved this inner conflict was by thinking that they were not the ones who were causing harm. Even though they played a role in it, they were simply following orders, and therefore they no longer felt responsible for their actions. So in my view, this does not make them in any way less responsible, but it helps me understand why they could bring themselves to do such things. And now that we have the historical context behind the study of Milgram, we can now focus our attention on the study itself. So Milgram wanted to understand why it seems so easy for someone to be influenced to hurting other people when they were ordered to do so. I'm not going to go into much detail on this study, especially because nowadays it is quite a controversial study and it's sort of outdated, which means it would very hardly be replicated nowadays, especially because there's other ethical norms in place. But there's a lot of information online and there's a lot of interesting variations on this study, so I'm sure you'll be able to find more details about it should you be interested. I just wanted to make it clear that I'm only bringing up this study not because I think the study's methods and conclusions are flawless, because there really aren't, but I'm just bringing it up because I think it demonstrates that we should look at the past in order not to make the same mistakes in the future. And for me, this is really the takeaway message. It just suggests that under certain circumstances and when in the presence of authority figures, it's hard for us not to follow an order, even if the order implies that we will be inflicting pain on another human being. Obviously, this doesn't mean that we take these kind of orders lightly. As I said, we will certainly be in an inner conflict state and experience cognitive dissonance, but we resolve this conflict by telling ourselves that as we are merely following orders, then this makes us less responsible for whatever it was that we were instructed to do. But there are other ways that we could come to resolve this conflict. Turning back to the example about smoking, how can someone continue to smoke knowing that it is bad? And how can they do it without this making them feel bad about themselves? It's very important to consider this because cognitive dissonance, in my view, is the first step in order to make change happen. We need to feel bad and uncomfortable in order to change something. This, I feel, is really a requirement for change to take place. It's just like when we work out, for instance. Our muscles only get bigger when under a certain level of tension. You know your body is bound to change when you put it under pressure. And in this case, pain is not an indicator that something is wrong, but rather an indicator that something will change. The psychological pain caused by cognitive dissonance should be approached in the same way. It should be seen as a sign that something needs to change. When we experience cognitive dissonance, there's 3 things we can do about it. Firstly, we can change our minds about a certain behavior and just ditch this behavior. Going back to the smoking example, this would mean giving up smoking. Secondly, we can introduce new beliefs. For instance, if we think smoking leads to lung cancer, then if we read something on the news, such as it's not scientifically proven that smoking causes lung cancer, then we will give more importance to this new information. And finally, we can reduce the importance we give to pre-existing beliefs. For instance, lung cancer would only be a problem if we wanted to live a long life. But if we tell ourselves that we're happy with just living a short life, as long as we get to do what we want, and therefore continue on smoking, then this will reduce cognitive dissonance. As a final note on this, and going back to where we started, we often look at these obedience studies and we immediately think that we would not behave in the same way that the participants did. Just like when we hear about the police officer that killed George Floyd and we naively think that we would never do such a thing. And I want to urge you not to think this way. Try to not resolve your cognitive dissonance by believing that you're different from these people. I think we should be okay with being uncomfortable instead of thinking that we would never do such things without giving it considerate thought. We should instead try to educate ourselves on how to avoid doing such things instead of just assuming we would never be able to do it. So the other day I was listening to this humanitarian psychologist who basically goes on humanitarian missions in refugee camps all around the world. And he said something that I believe people usually don't do, and that I think everyone who actively seeks to put an end to racism should do. He said that every time someone sends him a message where it is clear that they're against refugees, instead of spreading hate and telling them that they're awful and that they have no heart, like one so often sees on social media, instead he invites them out for a coffee so that they can have the opportunity to exchange opinions. And this is what makes change happen. This really should not be about dividing the world into racists and non-racists, because this only deviates attention from what's really important, which is putting an end to discrimination. Thank you for joining me on one more episode, and I'll see you next time.